Hello there, sword friends. This is going to be a random sword type video where I answer a couple questions about eBay sellers and custom swords and what that means. I tend to get a lot of questions about eBay selling swords and basically a misunderstanding between two ways the word custom is used. And I hope that some of the examples that I'm going to share here will help you understand the difference, because I often say, like, hey, this custom katana is pretty cool, or you should try to buy one because the sense of refinement and feeling is so much better. And then you go to look online and you see a lot of various vendors that mass produce swords, whether it be in China or elsewhere, though most notably for katana as well as many other swords or many products in general, they are manufactured in China. Now, this is not to say that a Chinese smith is not capable of making a custom sword. It's just that the products on the market that are advertised as custom use the term in a perhaps different way. And it's important as a sword buyer to understand the differences and basically have clear expectations about what you're going to get when you buy them. Anyway, this video is largely to clear up perhaps what the word custom is when I talk about them as it relates to custom swords, or when the community at large talks about a custom katana, and when you go and buy one online and you see custom katana, what those terminologies might mean. Anyway, I'm going to get into the thick of the video here in just a moment. You see my apparatus is hopefully going to help illustrate some of the differences here. But the main thing that I want to note is I have 4 examples set out, and they both were chosen for a reason from the plethora of stuff that I have around me. But first and foremost, I'm going to break out this one, and just to give a brief explanation or introduction in each one. This is a sword made by Prismic, and my lighting is terrible on my face and it doesn't show this particularly well, but this is what I would describe when I talk about a custom katana. This is kind of what I mean. Now, a smith by the name of Prismic, if I'm saying his name right, made the blade. He gave it individual attention, and what I mean by that is oftentimes when you buy a sword that's mass-produced, the blade is made in masses. There's lots of videos online of the manufacturing process that happens, and at several different stages. They're kind of done in batches, as you would expect from a mass production thing. It's done in a large batch. But the downside of that is that, well, you might not necessarily get what you're hoping for. The heat treatment process, whether it be for tempering, or not necessarily for tempering, basically the hardening process to create the hamon, is pretty stressful on the steel, and it can crack and there can be flaws, and sometimes those can be missed if you're not giving a sword individual attention. Hell, it can probably be missed if you are giving it individual attention and you're inexperienced. So a sword made by a knowledgeable, talented smith that has received some individual attention is less likely to have those fatal flaws, and more likely to feel better, because that person knows how a sword should feel and is kind of dicking around with it basically until it feels right to them. Now, that's also subject to the smith's level of experience and a myriad of other factors, but those basic 2 factors tend to weigh pretty heavily on my mind as I think about a respected, talented smith making a custom sword. You have a person devoting their full attention to making one blade and using their craft talent and experience to do the best job they can with it. Then when I talk about custom, this saya was carved for this blade. It wasn't pre-carved based on a template. It wasn't pre-carved to fit a generic size. It was made just for this one blade. I sent the blade to the person, the mystery man in black as it was, to craft the saya and the ska. And both of these components, both the handle and the saya, were carved to fit one specific blade, not a generic template. Now, as an example, I have this. Granted, it's not for a katana, it's for a European sword, but it still holds true. There's a handle from a prototype Ronin European sword, and you can see that it's kind of pre-manufactured. And what that means is, the hole is larger, you slide the tang through, you fill the rest with epoxy. The difference is that you don't get the same result. Oftentimes, katanas are made the same way from a factory standpoint. They will either have a handle that's kind of pre-carved out and made a little bit larger. Maybe it can be shimmed, maybe it can be glued, they can put some resin stuff in it, or epoxy to make it fit, or maybe they can just hammer it on with a mallet and get it friction fit that way. The downside is that, if these parts aren't made for the specific blade, in the saya's case, it might rattle, or maybe it's too tight and it might split, or it might bind. If it's made for the blade, the likelihood of it being fit the way it's supposed to, drawing the way it's supposed to, sheathing the way it's supposed to increases. The handle, if the handle is made for the specific Nakago, for the specific tang, it fits on right, it comes off right for the purposes of cleaning. Oftentimes, this can actually lead to a handle that feels a little looser, or can, I guess, loosen up more readily than a sword that comes from a mass production place, because they're hammered on and then epoxied. Makes them notoriously difficult to take off at times, but at the same time, they stay on really well. If you never take the katana apart, maybe it holds on a little better. But a lot of times, to clean these, to basically, if you're trying to get them made in a way that katanas are made, they should come off relatively easily. You're supposed to be able to kind of give your wrist a pound and the blade should kind of jump out a little bit, and that's how simple it should be to take out. That doesn't typically happen with most of the mass production pieces that I have, and a lot of that has to do with the assembly. They make the handle somewhere else, whether it be the core or the whole wrapping in various different sizes and colors, and then when you order one, you're not necessarily getting a custom sword, though it does come to the measurements of your specification. They just kind of pound it on to fit the blade. The blades obviously do have some hand making in a mass production way, but the trick is that you have some minute differences, some thickness differences, some kind of curvature differences. So when you pound them on, it makes it more likely that the ska will crack. It makes it more likely that they're going to have to put a bunch of shims in there, which don't make it necessarily sit exactly the way it's supposed to. You're more likely to get a sword that's canted or off center as well. And so those are all kind of downsides of the mass production thing. Now, it's not to say that they're always going to be flawed, but it is to say that there's an increased risk of doing that. And when you see a sword for a couple $100s, it's kind of, I don't know, the same way as food. If you go to a restaurant and somebody grinds the meat and mixes in a whole bunch of fixins, and that chef really knows what they're doing to make your food, and they put all this stuff together and individually give their full attention to your meal, you come out with a more savory experience, or a more pleasant dining experience, presumably. If you go to McDonald's or any fast food chain, any kind of mass custom, you can order a custom burger, as it were. You can say no pickles and I want extra mustard. But basically, they have all of those ingredients pre-made. Your burger patty was probably frozen or semi-cooked or assembled in some way somewhere else. They flip it for a predetermined amount of time, and hopefully it comes out consistent. Though in the case of fast food, I would argue that they probably come out much more consistent than the katanas have shown to. Though flipping a burger is I don't know if it's more or less complicated, but I would say probably less complicated. Or maybe McDonald's just has it down to a science. That is a different nerdy rant. The point is, though, that when I'm talking about a custom sword, this handle core, the wood underneath here, was made for this particular tang under here. These fittings are made not necessarily for this blade, but they were made of a size that would fit this particular blade. And these fittings are then, this saya is made to match them. The saya is basically made to kind of match the fuchi and line up. If the fittings are too small, it doesn't work. If they're too large, it looks dumb. The fittings don't necessarily have to be made, though in I guess, some custom scenarios, they certainly may be. Also, you may have fittings that are made to match. Again, I'm going off the deep end here. My main point is to say that the saya and the handle are carved for this individual blade, and the individual blade was made by a person that gave it individual attention and was respected in their craft. And subsequently, the result is a very refined, good-feeling sword. So the next bit is if I go to a company like Hanwei. This is a Way Orchid Katana, and I don't know a ton. I don't want to speak falsely about Hanwei's manufacturing process, but very often you have these fittings that are pre-made. You have handles that might be pre-made, or they're done in an assembly situation. Now this one, it doesn't rattle. It fits pretty well. The handle isn't bad. But if I move on to the sword that I broke, I did what would be called a custom katana with this Ryujin piece. But custom is basically, from a supply chain nerdy perspective, mass customization. The same way if you go to a computer, you want to order a computer, you can go online and you can pick, I want this processor, I want this much RAM, but all of those components are already made, and your order it's a custom computer for you, but they didn't really make the parts for you. They just had those parts, assembled it, and then shipped it to you. These work in a very similar capacity. They had this saya, they had a handle, or maybe they had to assemble-ish a component for me, but basically they just kind of put these things together. I could pick my Tsuba, they picked the Tsuba and stuck it on there, but it wasn't necessarily made for me at that time. It wasn't necessarily assembled. This saya wasn't made, or this handle wasn't made just for the blade that I ordered. It was already made and then made to fit and made to work together. And so manufacturers in China often preach these or say these things are custom katana. It's a custom thing. You customize the blade, the geometry, the hamon, the bohi, all of the geometry and all the features and stuff like that you might have some say in. Sometimes they may very well make the blade for you. In other cases, they may have some stock of a blade already made like that, or be able to fit a blade that's already in their possession to work for your specifications. And then they have these fittings or these parts already made to a specific size, and they kind of just put them together and send you a sword. But that's how you can get a sword so inexpensive. This Ryujin Katana, when I did the review, I was basing it off $500, but I think it's actually closer to $300. I should actually think about that harder, but $300 for a sword kind of made to fit the way you want is a pretty stunning price given the amount of laborious work that it takes to do that. A custom sword like this prismic piece, I'd imagine if you were to have it done, I'm selling this one for about $2,500 or $2,700. Again, I should probably be more familiar with my own prices, but I digress. The point is that this is a couple $1,000s, and it represents a lot more individual person's individual time, and the cost for it is much higher. So if you want to get a custom sword where you're picking things for $300, I mean, this is all in all on the less expensive side of custom swords. There are more out there that cost way more money, but this represents a pretty inexpensive iteration of a custom thing. Prismic has been swordsmithing for a few years. He's a talented smith, but he's not as renowned as some of the most lauded names in the industry. The guy that mounted it does a great job, and well, the mystery man in black, I won't talk too much because he doesn't like it, but I think he does a great job. It's a custom made saya, and it just represents a lot more work. The saya cost more to make this one wooden piece than the whole Ryujin Katana down there, and I suppose that represents the amount of labor and the location of that labor. Anyway, the other bits that I've kind of introduced those two. I have a Citadel Katana here as well. Now this is technically a mass production sword. There were 100 of these made. This is the bamboo katana, but the reason I brought it out is that this sword is around $2,800 new, but I think it actually represents about as close as you can get to a custom sword right out of the gate. It's a great sword, and I put it here because it's about the same price as the prismic sword, which is a fully kind of custom thing, versus a semi-custom. Now, I say semi-custom because a lot of these pieces are handmade. I believe the handle is made to fit the individual piece. It's not shimmed. The saya appears to be the same type of thing, where a lot of the traits that you find in only custom katana seem to be the case with this one. So it's not just 100% that any manufactured or mass-produced thing is made one way, but this sword costs the same amount of money as the custom sword that I'm selling. Made, I believe they have production facilities in Cambodia. The Hanwei piece is made in China. Though it's not made in Longchuan or Longquan, it's made in Dalian, China, if I'm saying the name right. I'm obviously not super familiar. So it's made in a slightly different location from much more renowned, I suppose, or seasoned manufacturer, and they also do a pretty good job. Anyway, I'm going to kind of elaborate on some of the differences. So I've talked about the process, right? And I think there's a lot of videos that have talked about the process, but now I'm going to open up this camera here and I'm going to show you some of the differences in what you get, so it hopefully makes more sense. Now, the first thing that I'm going to point out is just the ito and the effective tightness of said ito. So in my review of this katana, you got to see me talk a little bit about said ito, and it wasn't super tight, but it was serviceable. But notice that this has been used. I want to note it's been through hell, and these swords have not necessarily been through the same hell. I've used the Citadel actually quite a bit since I received it, but this one's been through hell and not necessarily made it out the other side. But the diamonds, when I got it, were uneven. This Samegawa panel was kind of bunched up, and notably, the Ryujin representative said that this is not kind of this is below their standard to say, and it really shouldn't have gone out this way, and that's the note I got from Ryujin. That said, this I think is really symptomatic or par for the course for what I see from a lot of Chinese manufactured katana. You can look on my channel and see a myriad of different swords, and some of them are above or below this standard, but nevertheless, these diamonds kind of being off-centered, being able to see the lines or the edge of where the Samegawa is, being able to move around some of the pieces, seeing this transition ledge here, This is not necessarily the worst example either. There are some that are much worse than this. Now it's disassembled, so take it with a grain of salt, but you can still see the unevenness, kind of how off-center some of the diamonds are, how different the shapes are. This one's smaller, but this is larger and kind of thinner. This one's bigger, this one's kind of just goofy. You can make out the panel here, you can make it out here and here. It's not necessarily the cleanest sword. The Ito was stained when I got it. The Samegawa is damaged. And these, I think, are things that I mentioned in my earlier review. Now, this sword is $300. Here we go up to the Orchid. This is a much more expensive sword. And what we can see is, one, this kind of transition here. This is where the panel is. Now, this is not a fully wrapped ska, so that means that the Samegawa doesn't go fully around the handle. There is a panel of Samegawa sitting right here, and you can make its ledge out quite clearly here. Now, I can't necessarily see the ledge. I can make it out a little bit over here, but I don't necessarily see it through the corner. So it's hidden, but it's kind of not hidden because I can make it out based on where the Ito is right here. In terms of tightness, it's really similar to this Jayco piece in that it's tight, it's serviceable, it's good, but you can see it moving underneath my fingers as I apply pressure. Now I'm applying a reasonable amount of pressure, and this doesn't mean that it's unusable or bad, but it's certainly not ideal. So as we look at this, the skin actually is pretty good. Now also on this one the nodules are very small, and this one the nodules are quite larger, but this is a much more expensive sword. I think you can find these for probably around $800 new, somewhere in there, and used would be less than that, obviously. But the Ito is moving around somewhat, and so, but as I look, I can make out the panel. The shape is small and not necessarily too bad. This is a pretty good example. The diamonds, however, do kind of bounce around a little bit. This one's a little larger, a little small, a little smaller. They also kind of go off center. Here we have one, and there's, I don't know, maybe 1/8 of an inch difference in terms of where they land on the handle. And they bounce around a little bit. It's not as bad as this one is, but it also costs more money. Now, as we go up to the Citadel Sword, so this one is one that I think is a great example of what money can buy you in a mass production realm. Even though it's not necessarily mass production, it still falls in line with a brand that has made 100 of this iteration of katana. Notice though that the diamonds, while they are on the smaller side, are at least relatively even. These kind of edges don't terminate in very different spots. This one's a little lower, as is this one, but by and large they're pretty consistent. The Ito as well is very tight. If I apply the same amount of pressure in some spots, I can move it, but I really have to kind of torque on it. It's very, very tight. By and large, it doesn't move around a lot. I have to apply quite a bit more pressure. You might be able to tell by the coloration of my thumb. Also, the transitions here are great. They don't, there's no issue on the Hanwei. I suppose it's worth noting that the transitions aren't necessarily bad either. This bunches up a little bit, but it's not bad. The Citadel, it's not 100% perfect, though it's seen some use, but the transitions are good. The shape is good. The Ito is tight. The panel is nice, and I don't make out any kind of seam along the edge here because it's got a full wrap of Samegawa. This white substance underneath here has been wrapped all the way around the handle, then bound in silk, which makes structurally a more resilient handle. Now, traditionally, I should note that it could be done this way or this way. Sometimes the Japanese folks would say Samegawa is very expensive and prized, and we don't want to waste it along the parts that you're not going to see it. So to make it look right, we're going to just put a panel in. That was done in some cases traditionally, though. From a structural integrity point, ideally, you would have the Samegawa wrapped all the way around. In the custom sword, you can kind of see that there is some mild variation in the pieces, mostly along where the Manuki are and where the peg lines up here, but by and large, the diamonds are very uniform. They're of a larger size, so you can make out the Samegawa panel. They're not so teeny. And the Ito is very, very, very tight. If I really push on it, it still doesn't move. Now, this hasn't been handled really much at all, and the diamonds are very consistent, very smooth, very good, very uniform. The transitions line up perfectly, which is exactly what you'd hope for. The knot is very, very tight and good. And then we can move on to, and I've talked about the Ito, the shaping, the transitions. We can talk about some of some of the fittings. So this piece has cast fittings, and they're not necessarily bad. Granted, it's not on here. If I grab the Tsuba, it originally came with this one, but just as likely I could have ordered any of these other kind of mass production Chinese made Tsuba to fit on here to my liking. The fittings though are nevertheless cast, and they're not of a bad quality. Now Hanwei does a better job. These fittings are also cast. The patina on them has some shiny, shimmery blueness as well as an orchid theme. I think Hanwei actually does a really good job with their fittings. Their casting quality tends to be quite good, but nevertheless, these are cast pieces. As I move on to the Citadel, I'm not as familiar, honestly, with their manufacturing process, but I believe, from what I've seen on videos on the internet, that these are kind of hammered out and handmade Tsuba. So the bamboo Tsuba on here is much more elaborate than the lotus katana Tsuba would be, and I believe that is part of the difference in cost, is because the Tsuba is kind of handmade. At least that's the impression that I have. I don't know if the Manuki are handmade, and I don't know to what degree the Fuchikashira are handmade. They're not very elaborate. They have a nice patina on them that, again, I really like, but they appear to be a simple steel. The Fuchikashira here were made by a notable Sogu, if I'm saying that right, or a fittings maker, but this is Patrick Hastings' work versus Citadel's work, but a noted American artist that makes Fuchikashira. So this is from his semi-production line, which means that there's some degree of kind of machine-madeness and some degree of kind of hand attention. But what you can see is there's some embellished shapes here, some additional features that outline or I don't know, give depth to the overall fittings that are more elaborate than, at least in terms of shape-wise, because there's more to it. The fittings here are there's a lot of little edges to them, but they're not sharp. They're all chamfered. It's also got a patina on it, which is this deep brown, very pretty color. I do like the shiny black though as well, but this deep kind of brown aged patina. It's not a paint color, which is in some cases like this. I'm not sure if it's a patina or a paint. In other cases like this, again, the same type of thing. I don't know if this is a patina or a paint or something like that of some kind, but in any case, I'm sure that this is a patina of sorts. The other thing I can note about the assembly here is if I look at the Nikago. Now this is something that not everyone is going to necessarily see. In the realm of $300 swords, there's plenty of practitioners that will use it for EI. Well, basically they'll never take it apart. They'll never see this level of detail. Now the Jeko, or not Jeko, the Ryujin sword here has a signature. It's been engraved. It's not necessarily that bad, though it looks like it's kind of done with a more of a hand tool rather than a specific file, and it has some notion of the serial number on it. This is more elaborate than the worst of swords, I suppose I should say. It could be much worse than this, but notice that there's not necessarily any specific file marking. It's a rough kind of belt sander looking grind to it. And it has a signature on here. It does have a ridge line that follows. Sometimes these can be just completely flat or so generic that you don't make out any kind of signature or any kind of file marking. This is, for a $300 sword, frankly more than is expected. Now, the Hanwei, again, you can find these for around $800. I'm not really looking, but notice that the signature on here is actually quite good. Hanwei stands out as one of the manufacturers that in general, not always, not consistently, because on the Oni Katana recently I looked and it looked a lot more akin to this than this, but notice that there's specific file markings, specific grinds that follow a pattern. Is it perfect? No, it's not, but it's better than not, and the engraving here appears to be done with a hand chisel of some sort. I'm guessing this is not done with any kind of hand, specific motorized hand tool, though it may be. It has a serial number, some sort of date code engraved in it. The Nikago is small. The holes are a little off, but nevertheless, this is kind of how it goes. Now, the limitation is with both of these, they have a handle. They put it on, and then, if the handle already has a hole drilled in it, which it may very well, they kind of fit it and then drill a hole. At least this is my speculation. The same with the Hanwei. So you tend to see holes that might fall a little close to the edge, because the handle is already made and they're kind of at the mercy of where the Nikago fits in. Again, based on some of the videos I'm seeing, that's kind of my guess. The Citadel piece is much nicer. You have specific file markings of a more fine area. The signature is quite good. They have kind of a stamped piece here. The holes are on the center and they don't have any kind of pieces close to the edge, and this one's not necessarily close to the edge, although it certainly could be on yours. I imagine they move around a little bit. They're not always exactly where they should be, but this is pretty close to the ridge line here. And then we have a serial number on the other side. The bohi flows through. This is a touch that I personally like. It's not, I mean, you probably see this in more historic kind of cut down swords, but it's a nice little touch, I suppose, that the bohi follows through. Anyway, the point is that there are file markings that are consistent. It's a much nicer presentation than any of these three. And again, $2,800, $300, $800. There's certainly a cost difference. Now, for the custom piece, you can see that the file markings are there. Honestly, I don't think they're as nice as the Citadel, though they are there. They're just a little more haphazardly placed. And if I go around, we have, again, a clear center line. It wavers a little bit. The hole has been deliberately placed where it's supposed to be to line up with the handle. The handle was made to fit this Nikago. The hole was drilled to fit specifically where it needed to go. Anyway, you can see that the file markings are good. Now, these are examples of adequate file markings. The, what is it, Usuri May or file signature. Sometimes smiths can tell who made the sword based on how these file markings are done. There are American smiths and smiths outside of Japan that have kind of signature-esque file markings, but note, this is a part that nobody sees, though if you look at it, you can kind of tell if they put this much attention to a part that you don't necessarily see, well, chances are they paid a lot more attention to the rest of the sword as well. And it's one of those things that gives you an identifier of how well made a sword can be. Another little thing to look at is these. So this is a seppa, a little washer piece. Now on the Citadel, I don't know how custom made these are. This is really tight and is not coming off, but in this case, these are individually made and sized seppa, made to fit specifically to get the right tension between this peg and kind of here to make the handle fit on well. And the Hanwei and the Ryujin sword, they are kind of a generic one-size-fits-all. You see the same thing over and over and over again. They are the same kind of generic seppa that you see in China. They do come in various sizes, and maybe it's presumptive of me to assume they're all the same, but they have the same kind of pattern along the edge, the same tooth pattern, and you see the same thing. The Citadel looks different. I don't know how custom made, or maybe they have a batch of these. I'm not sure, but these individually are made. You can tell they're a little thicker than average because that's just how it worked out, and they're different sizes here. Now, as I move on, custom swords, you have the Hibachi. And as I look at the Hibachi, one thing I'm supposed to note, here we have a Tsuba that moves down. Here, it's super tight and fit on. Here, again, same thing. This one, obviously, I've taken off before. But note that these Hibachi really look the same. They're kind of the same brass, what you see all the time Hibachi. And if I move these down, the Munmachi, Hamachi, this kind of has an upward angle. This is straight. They're offset. Let's see if I can... This is so shiny too that I don't know how well I can. Well, it's not moving, but chances are you would have. I'm going to speculate that the Hamachi, Munmachi look actually probably really similar to this. The Citadel, it's not moving either. Let's see if I can. Okay, with a little bit of oomph, it comes out. And now the Hibachi on this is a little bit on the odd side. It's a little tall, but I like that it follows. I mean, this is, maybe a break from tradition, but maybe not. I guess I can't say I know enough about it. But the Hibachi certainly isn't moving really easily. Anyway, these may or may not be offset. The Hibachi is nevertheless a copper piece. It's made to fit this sword. It fits really well. It's quite nice. In my opinion, though, there are people, I think, that would certainly disagree and say that it's wonky and weird looking. Nevertheless, it has a different flair. I think it's on the nicer side, though. This really should come off. Now, this Hibachi was made by Prismic, who notably is not a fan of necessarily making Hibachi, but it moves, and the Hamachi, Munmachi are even. They line up where they're supposed to. This is not the best Hibachi. It was made by Prismic and touched up by the Mystery Man in Black, and it's certainly far from a perfect Hibachi. There are much better out there, but for a inexpensive custom sword, it fits and does the thing that it's supposed to do, and it lines up the way it's supposed to. It could be certainly more perfect, but I would say it's probably a closer to what you want than this. Despite the embellishments, this is probably my preferred size, shape, and overall presentation. Then we can talk a little bit about the saya. The basic gist is that these two are made to fit the blade. They're going to draw differently, though I do find that the Citadel binds a little bit, even still after a few weeks or more than a few weeks of use. It still binds just a little bit, though it's gotten better. This one drew pretty straight out of the box, and the Hanwei's, you know, this one actually isn't bad, though Hanwei can be a little hit or miss. This one still has some gunk and whatnot on it. It's broken. It never really did draw all that well. It honestly wasn't that bad. This is a pretty good example of how close you can hit the mark, honestly. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't rattle a lot. It's now a broken and destroyed sword, so it's not really fair for me to judge how much it does or does not rattle at this point. But you can look to my earlier review to find my thoughts on this particular sword when it was intact. In any case, it's not perfect. It's not as certainly good as either of these, though. To do Iaido, this is so much easier, quieter. It doesn't bind. It does what it's supposed to. It's a much more pleasant saya to draw. Now, if I look at the embellishments, we have kind of a unique, custom, one-of-a-kind type paint job here. Though, honestly, if you look at it, this is such a subjective thing. The saya works better to draw in the custom case. The Prismic and the Citadel piece definitely work better, though this one binds. This one is just exactly the way it's supposed to be. It feels comfortable in the hand. It draws really nicely. It sheathes quietly. It holds the Hibachi the way it's supposed to. And it has a unique and interesting kind of paint job on it, though that is the subjective. It doesn't have to have a unique and paint job on it. It can be just a solid color, or it can be more embellished. This has Samegawa and whatnot. There's a lot of different options. The main point that I'm talking about with saya isn't necessarily the coloration or aesthetic choices. The implementation, execution, and overall thought that goes into those is just a different thing. The Citadel does nice. It's worth noting that there's not a transition here. The Ryujin sword also isn't bad. There's not transitions on these mother of pearl inlays, and I think they're quite nice. The Hanwei has nice, smooth, even lacquer, though I will admit that the deployment of this very phallic-shaped kind of kojiri at the end here has some splits in the paint, and it's not perfect. Ideally, this would be inset in the sword, though I understand that's a pain in the ass to do. And you can honestly see where this, where the carving kind of toes in a little bit to meet this edge, and it just, I don't know, it creates kind of a dick shape. The point is, though, that these two saya look better. This one, certainly, the execution from a user practitioner standpoint is just better than any of the others. And that's because the guy that made this sword, the Mystery Man in Black, the one who did the assembly on this, is a swordsman himself. He knows how they're supposed to feel, how they're supposed to move, how they're supposed to hold up, and he did the job. Now, the flip side is, the Mystery Man in Black is a swordsman, and he makes things that are robust and hold up well, and this is a thick, kind of stout saya. Now, it's not something that I necessarily advocate you whacking somebody in the face with, but you could if you if the mood struck you, and it'd probably still hold up. The Citadel is a more delicate, it has a tapered shape, it's thinner and smaller, and it has a what I would almost call maybe a more traditional shape than the one that the Mystery Man in Black has constructed, though it is more fragile, notably. It's not going to hold up as long, and I certainly wouldn't smack anyone in the face with it, though I don't know that you're supposed to do that. The Hanwei and the Ryujin sword are also very thick and robust, though the implementation, I would certainly say, looks less elegant, and the transitions between everything don't line up as well. So I think balancing, you know, notably the Mystery Man in Black, I'm aware he makes stuff that is made to last and is a bit a bit hardier and ready for practitioner usage, and I appreciate that, and so I certainly don't mind it. But this to me seems like the best saya, and not necessarily for the aesthetic reasons, but more for the fact that it handles the way it's supposed to, and it's going to hold up a long time. Now the blade, the part that most people care about, and honestly the part that I'm probably going to talk about the least. You have a variety of differences here. This $300 sword is a single type of steel, mono steel as it's often referred to, and it doesn't, it shows some character. You can see my review for more elaborate shots, but it doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of interesting to talk about. It has a hamon. You can get lost in those patterns. I certainly enjoy them. It has some degree of interesting effects in the metal from the tempering. The Hanwei piece, they have a pretty unique actual kind of, this is very Hanwei from the standpoint that you see this very frosty hamon. The hada on there, well, it's not showing up in this light, is reasonably bold and easy to spot. The shaping is also, quite good. The lines, as you may or may not be able to see here, are a little crisper along the shinogi. There's a difference in polish between this mirror edge here and a little frostier, more opaque look on the kind of blade side, or the beveled side of the blade. This one is one kind of mirror polish. It looks like it's been buffed, and these edges along the blade are softer, like they've kind of gone under a wheel sander. Here, not perfect, but better. The Citadel is the next step up, though admittedly still very dull. The hamon and whatnot here are very simple, though I do notice a crisp, clean line. The bohi has some waver to it, but many bohi do. This is a lot more even and consistent. The lines along the spine are also much cleaner than average. The shape is quite good. I can make out, though this is not a folded steel. $2,800 still does not get you a folded steel. $800 does get you a folded steel. They're not necessarily going for that aesthetic, though, and in this case it actually has a very rudimentary polish, I would say, for this amount of money. It doesn't let you show a whole lot in the steel, and I kind of wonder what's underneath there if there was more polish brought into the mix. The Prismic, at roughly the same price, is ultimately Prismic made the blade and polished it. This was not done by a person who is great at polishing, and so Prismic is very soft in his line, though still kind of crisper than this. But honestly, Hanwei is pretty much right on par, and it's also very uniformly colored. Underneath here, there is a very active, very beautiful, very interesting hamon with a lot of character to it, but it doesn't come out in the right light because Prismic is not, well, he's not a polisher. He's a swordsmith, but bringing out this character is its own unique art form, and it's not his chosen profession. So it's even, it's smooth, it does the job for EI, but it's really akin to this Citadel piece in the sense that while there is a very active hamon, and well, you can actually see it a little better, and it has more character, I think, than the kind of general pattern that you see in the Citadel piece. You can see there's all sorts of little bits. It's like he's very influenced, I think, by Rick Barrett, and his hamon has some pretty wild character, but it's not brought out. It could use a heavier etch, and if you had somebody do an art polish on it, or a more elaborate polish, it would certainly stand out. I've had that done in the past by Chris Osborne on a Prismic blade, and there was a lot of character to it, lots of zazz, as I call it, though just ultimately the lines are better. And as I compare using them, you're not going to see that in this video. These two blades feel good. Personally, I like the Prismic. It's a little subjective, and I'm in it a lot of money, so there's a little bit of notable bias there. The point is, though, that in either case, these two swords feel better. I think the Prismic feels more intentional, more purpose-built. When I hold it in my hand, it feels more like somebody ultimately thought like how this blade should feel, and when the assembly was done, how it should ultimately feel in my hand. It feels more refined. The Citadel is also great. It feels really good in my hand. I enjoy the sensation. It cuts really well. I haven't really cut with the Prismic, so can't say how well it performs, but I have cut with the Citadel. It does a great job. The Lotus Katana here, not the Lotus, the Orchid Katana from Hanwei, very light, nimble feeling sword, though these feel like mass-produced pieces, and the weight and general shaping have a lot more to do with the execution and how it tangibly feels in my hand than the kind of individual dicking around that I suspect either of these two have had. The Prismic kind of messed around with this until the sword felt right and looked right and did what it was supposed to do, and ultimately he probably broke several attempts trying to get to this finished iteration of a blade. They may have cracked in heat treat, they may have not worked out the way he wanted, they may have had spots, but there's a lot more effort to get to the finish line than in either of these cases that were likely done in larger batches. And there's certainly a tangible sensation that comes out different. And so ultimately, the point I want to get to is that when you're buying a sword and it is a custom sword, there's a lot of different ways to ultimately describe that. And the way that I describe a custom sword is basically one that is being made by hand or by machine, but basically with an individual, reputable smith's attention. And that attention should translate into less flaws. There shouldn't be, when they're heat treating it or quenching the sword, they're listening for pings and tings and things that indicate that the steel is cracked or suffered a fatal flaw. They are paying attention. They're holding it in their hand and taking a little more off as they grind it or file it or do whatever their process is to make it feel the way that it's supposed to. When it's assembled, the saya and the handle should be made to the actual blade itself. That part should come first. And that they should be made to fit the way they're supposed to, draw the way that they're supposed to. And ultimately, as a practitioner, you feel those differences in a custom sword. When you look at something like this Ryujin sword, this is a mass customization sword. So there is an element of customization that goes into it, but it's not the same. Somebody is making the sword. They're probably making the sword in a few different types of batches. That's a bit... There's an assumption on my part. I don't know Ryujin's exact process, but as I've seen some of the videos online of the manufacturing processes in Chinese forges for swords, this does not indicate to me that one person gave it their individual attention the entire way through the production process. Various elements are constructed in separate kind of batch processes, and then they're assembled in the end based on the user's ultimate idea of what parts they want to put together. The result isn't necessarily a bad thing. I don't think for $300 it's a bad deal. I think that if that's what your budget is, you can get a pretty cool sword for that amount of money. But there is an order of magnitude in terms of the difference that you get with at least custom as I'm defining it, where it's made by a smith of note with a reputation, with a skill, with a passion, and nevertheless that smith, talented or untalented as they may be, gives their individual attention to one sword throughout the process, that they mess around with it, that the following people and craftsmen that are involved in the process have an equal level of passion and aptitude and knowledge to create something, and also futz with it until it feels and is functional in the way that a sword should be. And in the end, there's elements that I can do to help you understand that. There's the weapon dynamics computer, but I'm finding, well, that dynamics computer shows you certain elements of things in terms of its weight distribution and maybe how it feels in your hand. There are things that really can't be described by the dynamics computer, like how the shaping of the handle lets you index the blade and how grippy it is, or if it has any weird sensations or rattles or things that don't necessarily make a lot of sense, or that you're not necessarily going to get with the weapon dynamics computer, though maybe one day there will be. The point is that there's certainly a tangible difference between a individually handmade by people that know what they're doing sword, and if you have the money, if you have the budget, if you know that these type of objects are for you and it's justified for you to spend that amount of money, then you certainly get a difference. To me, it's worth it, but to you it may not be, and that's fine too. There are plenty of decent products out there for you to use to practice martial arts, to do cutting, that don't involve spending thousands of dollars. Though if you want the difference, I would certainly say there's a noticeable, tangible difference between some of the products that are mass-produced and some of them that are custom-made. So hopefully, if you're looking online and you're looking at a shop that says custom sword, you at least understand a little different about more about what you're getting. Again, I don't think it's a bad thing, and I hope that this video hasn't painted them in a negative light. The cost, you kind of get what you pay for. It's an old saying, but relatively true in most cases. And this is no different. When you pay $300, you're getting maybe a great value for $300, but you're not getting something that's at the same kind of level as what you would get if you were to pay $3,000. Now, it's certainly possible that there's a website that's going to sell you a $300 sword for $3,000, and that's not cool, and I hope you don't fall prey to one of them. But from a reputable smith, from a sword that's assembled, there are plenty of people out there that do various different implementations of the Japanese sword from a variety of different countries, and many of them are quite good. And I would say that there is a difference between the two. Hopefully, anyway, I'm going to stop rambling. Hopefully the point was to explain the difference between those two things. Hopefully I have done that. Hopefully it has been of some minor interest to you, and I'm gonna shut up now. Anyway, as always, cheers and thank you for watching.